Right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into the life and the philosophy of Robert F. Williams,
Okay.
a civil rights leader,
Mm-hmm.
but not exactly the kind of civil rights leader that you normally hear about.
Yeah.
And we're going to be looking at excerpts from his book Negroes with Guns.
Oh,
A
great.
pretty attention-grabbing title, I got to say.
Oh, absolutely it is. Yeah, and it really reflects the side of the civil rights movement that a lot of people don't know about
Yeah,
or often gets overlooked.
right.
And it's especially interesting when you think about the fact that Williams wrote this book from exile in Cuba in 1962.
Wow. Yeah.
So how does a civil rights leader end up in Cuba advocating for armed resistance?
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
Right.
Where do we even, like, how do we unpack this?
Right.
So much to talk about.
Yeah, well, let's start with Williams's hometown, Monroe, North Carolina.
Okay.
He returned there after serving in the Marine Corps and quickly became disillusioned with the local NAACP chapter.
Okay, so we have a veteran coming back,
Right.
and he's met with what was wrong with the NAACP?
Well, he saw them as too passive,
I
too focused on this idea of respectability politics and not nearly active enough in addressing, the daily injustices and the violence
Yeah.
that Black people in Monroe were facing.
Right.
So Williams, being the man of action that he decided to shake things up.
I can see how his military background would really factor into that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
That experience definitely instilled in him, a really strong sense of self-reliance and a belief in the right to defend oneself,
Right.
which would become, really central to his philosophy.
Hmm.
And so he pretty quickly rose within the ranks of the NAACP chapter,
Yeah.
recruited new members, a lot of them, fellow veterans, and really injected a new energy into the organization.
So he's pushing for a more active approach.
Yes.
What was the reality on the ground at the time?
Well, Monroe was a place where segregation was just deeply entrenched. I mean, we're talking whites only, swimming pools, Klan rallies, armed motorcades meant to intimidate Black residents. It was a constant atmosphere of fear and tension.
And were the authorities doing anything to protect Black citizens?
Sadly, no, not really. I mean, the police often turned a blind eye to the Klan's activities,
Wow. No.
which really left the Black community to fend for themselves.
But this is really a matter of survival then,
Absolutely.
not ideology.
Yeah, for William, self-defense wasn't about, seeking out violence or being, the aggressor in any way.
Right.
It was about protecting oneself and one's community from very real and present threats.
So how did this belief in self-defense actually manifest? I mean, did they start openly carrying guns, or what did that look like?
Well, it was more organized than that. Williams and the NAACP chapter, they formed a self-defense guard, trained in firearms, and prepared to respond to any attacks.
Wow.
And there's even a documented case where they successful defended the home of Dr. Perry,
Okay.
the chapter's a vice president, from a Klan attack.
So this is a bold move.
Yes.
Especially at a time when you have, the what we think of as the mainstream civil rights movement.
Right.
That's emphasizing nonviolence.
Exactly.
So is Williams completely opposed to nonviolence, or?
Well, it's more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Williams believed in meeting violence with violence,
Okay.
an eye for an eye philosophy, as he called it. And he saw nonviolence as a tactic that really only worked when you were dealing with an oppressor who had a conscience.
Okay.
But in the face of the Klan's brutality,
Yeah.
he felt that it was naive and even dangerous
Right.
to expect Black people to simply turn the other cheek,
Right.
you know?
If you're being attacked,
Yeah.
you have to defend yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
just logic, right?
Right.
So obviously this is putting him at odds
Yes.
with the national NAACP leadership.
Big time.
And this really all kind of comes to a head with what's known as the kissing case in 1958.
Yes.
So two young Black boys, I think they were 7 and 9 years old,
7 and 9, yeah.
get arrested for kissing a white girl.
Got it. This is...
They were playing a game,
Wow.
and one of them kissed this white girl on the cheek, and the reaction was completely disproportionate.
I mean, that is just...
They were arrested and charged with rape.
It's hard to believe that that's even possible.
I know, it's absurd.
Yeah, absurd.
Yeah. This case sparked international outrage.
Wow.
But even then, the national NAACP was kind of hesitant to get involved at first. They eventually did,
Okay.
but only after a lot of pressure from abroad. So this must have really, I mean, this whole case must have just solidified Williams' belief that, like,
Absolutely.
self-defense was the only option.
Without a doubt, yeah. I mean, he saw it as clear evidence that you couldn't rely on the law to
Right.
protect Black lives, especially Black children.
Right.
And this incident just further fueled his determination to arm and defend the Black community in Monroe.
So we have Williams advocating for armed self-defense.
Hmm.
We have the National NAACP promoting nonviolence. And then into this whole situation come the Freedom Riders,
Oh,
who
boy.
were committed to nonviolent protest.
Right. This is,
Talk about a recipe for conflict.
yeah, what could go wrong, right?
It was a very tense situation, for
Yeah,
sure.
get it?
Williams saw the Freedom Riders as brave but naive.
Okay.
You know, he believed that their nonviolent approach would only embolden the Klan
Mm-hmm.
and lead to even more violence.
Yeah.
And sadly, events would prove him right.
Oh, so things got even worse. Yes, the arrival of the Freedom Riders, while intended to, challenge segregation, actually escalated the violence in Monroe.
Wow.
And it all culminated in a really dramatic event on August 27th, 1961.
Okay.
That would change the course of Robert F. Williams's life, the Stegall incident.
Okay. Set the scene for me.
Okay, so imagine this. You have a white couple, the Stegalls,
Okay.
finding themselves driving through the Black community during a riot.
Oh, wow.
They're captured by an angry mob and their lives are in danger.
Oh, my God.
It's in this really chaotic and volatile situation that Robert F. Williams steps in.
This is where things get really intense.
Yeah. Okay, what did he do?
Well, instead of letting the mob have its way with the Stegalls, Williams decided to take a huge risk and bring them into his own home to protect them.
Wow.
He knew that if the mob got to them, the consequences would be disastrous for everyone involved,
Right.
especially for the Black community.
So he's putting his own safety on the line
Absolutely.
to protect this white couple from a Black mob. Yeah, it's a really complex situation, ethically and politically.
It is, yeah.
So what happened next? Well, things didn't exactly calm down.
Oh, no.
The police chief called Williams, but instead of, offering help,
Right.
he threatened to lynch him if he didn't hand over the Stegalls.
Wow.
So fearing for his life and the lives of his family, Williams decided to flee Monroe with his wife and kids.
Wow.
They became fugitives,
Wow.
first seeking refuge in New York, then Canada, and eventually finding asylum in Cuba.
So it starts with him protecting this couple,
Mm-hmm.
and it ends with him having to flee for his life.
Right.
Yeah.
It's crazy how quickly things escalated.
It is, and then he ends up in Cuba.
Yeah,
That's quite a leap.
it is. And this exile in Cuba is where Williams really steps onto the international stage.
Okay.
He becomes a very vocal critic of the U.S. government and
Okay.
its hypocrisy on racial issues,
Mm.
using radio broadcasts to reach audiences back in the States.
He's broadcasting from Cuba, directly challenging the U.S. government.
Yeah, exactly. And he was not holding anything back.
What was his message? What was he saying?
He was calling out the gap between America's talk of, freedom and democracy
Right.
and the reality of segregation and racial violence back home.
Right.
He specifically targeted the U.S. Justice Department
Right.
for its inaction in Monroe, accusing them of complicity in the Klan's reign of terror.
So he's taking it beyond the local,
Yes.
level, and he's saying this is
Exactly.
This is
He's
national.
He's connecting the situation in Monroe to these larger national and international issues.
I mean, was he trying to put pressure on the U.S. government through international attention?
Exactly. He was drawing parallels between the fight for Black liberation in the U.S. and struggles against colonialism and imperialism around the world.
Okay.
He argued that America's racism was undermining its credibility on the global stage,
Right.
especially during the Cold War when the U.S. was, trying to win over newly independent nations in Africa and Asia.
So he's saying, hey, world, look how the U.S. treats its own citizens.
Yeah.
How can you trust them to be a beacon of freedom and democracy?
Exactly. And you
Yeah.
have to remember, this is the early 1960s,
Right.
a time of immense global upheaval,
Right.
the Cold War, the dismantling of colonial empires, the rise of new ideologies.
Mhm.
Williams was tapping into this global energy and positioning the fight for Black liberation as part of a larger worldwide struggle for human rights and self-determination.
That's powerful.
It is.
But he's also still a fugitive from the U.S.
Right.
facing kidnapping charges.
Yeah.
Did his exile and his increasingly radical rhetoric make it harder for people back home to support him?
It definitely made him a more polarizing figure.
Okay.
He continued to criticize the mainstream civil rights movement,
Okay.
particularly its emphasis on nonviolence.
Okay.
He argued that nonviolence was only effective if the oppressor had a conscience, which he felt was not the case with white racists.
I can see how that would rub some people the wrong way.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
especially those who were committed to nonviolence as a core principle.
Right.
But did he offer any alternatives? What did he propose instead of nonviolence?
Yeah.
Well, he advocated for armed self-defense, arguing that it was not only a right, but a moral imperative for Black people to defend themselves against racist violence.
Okay.
He believed that advocating for nonviolence in the face of brutal and unrelenting violence was essentially disarming Black people
Right.
and leaving them vulnerable to further attack.
You have the right to protect yourself.
Exactly.
And in fact, you have a duty to protect yourself and your community.
Right.
Did he have any, did he cite any examples of armed resistance being successful in the past?
Oh, yeah. He pointed to historical figures like John Brown, who used violence to fight slavery,
Right.
and argued that there were times when armed resistance was the only option for oppressed people to secure their freedom.
And that's something that's still being debated today.
Absolutely.
In the context of Black Lives Matter and...
All sorts of movements.
Yeah, it's interesting how Williams's ideas resonate with these contemporary discussions about racial justice and self-defense.
It is.
His voice seems to echo across the decades.
It does. It does. But let's get back to his experience in Cuba.
Okay.
What was life like for him there?
Well, Williams wasn't content to just sit on the sidelines.
Okay.
He continued to write and publish detailing instances where the local police and legal system in the U.S. failed to protect Black citizens from racist violence.
Okay.
And he also highlighted the importance of safeguarding dignity and self-respect in the face of constant degradation and humiliation, arguing that armed self-defense was essential for achieving this.
So it's going beyond just the physical
Yes.
protection. Psychological, it's emotional.
Exactly. He argued that by demonstrating a willingness to fight back, Black people could force the white power structure to take them seriously and acknowledge their demands for equality. He believed that this sense of fearlessness and self-reliance was essential for Black empowerment.
Yeah.
Shifting the balance of power and creating a more just and equitable society.
How did he propose achieving that shift in power?
Well,
Was it all about armed self-defense, or did he have other strategies in mind?
Well, he was also a fierce advocate for Black self-determination and economic empowerment.
Okay.
He criticized the, what he called the Black elite.
Oh,
Those he saw as more interested in maintaining their own positions within the white power structure than in fighting for the liberation of all Black people.
right.
He believed that true liberation required control over resources, institutions, and political power,
Okay.
and that the fight for equal rights was inextricably linked to the struggle for economic equality.
So he's connecting the dots between
Absolutely.
different forms of oppression.
Yes, recognizing the intersection of race, class, and power.
Yeah, so how did he plan to, disseminate these ideas? Was he just relying on radio broadcasts?
Well, Williams understood the power of media and propaganda.
Right.
He was constantly battling against the racist stereotypes and distortions that were being perpetuated in the press, both in the South and nationally.
Right.
And to counter this, he published his own newsletter, The Crusader,
Right.
which provided a platform for Black voices and perspectives that were often excluded from mainstream media.
So he's taking control of the narrative,
Exactly.
offering a counter-narrative to the,
Right.
dominant media portrayal.
Exactly.
That's pretty savvy.
It is.
But how did he reconcile his advocacy for armed self-defense with the nonviolent principles of the mainstream civil rights movement?
Well, he didn't shy away from this contradiction.
Okay.
In fact, he challenged the traditional narrative of the civil rights movement, which often focuses on, charismatic leaders and peaceful protests.
Right.
He highlighted the role of ordinary Black people,
Okay.
those who organized, armed themselves, and stood up to the Klan in their communities. He saw them as the unsung heroes of the movement,
Yeah.
the ones who put their lives on the line to defend their families and their communities.
He's trying to reclaim the narrative,
Exactly.
to give voice to those
Yeah.
who were often silenced,
Right.
ignored.
And he was also critical of the idea that progress could only be achieved through incremental reforms.
Yeah.
He argued that true liberation required a fundamental transformation of society,
Okay.
and that armed self-defense was a necessary part of that struggle.
So we've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
from Williams's early activism in Monroe to his exile in Cuba and his development of this radical philosophy of black liberation.
Right.
But we haven't talked about his eventual return to the U.S.
Right.
and his lasting legacy.
Right.
What happened after Cuba? Because he stayed there permanently?
Well, in 1969, the kidnapping charges against Williams were finally dropped.
Okay.
And this paved the way for him to return to a very different America than the one he had left behind.
Yeah, I mean, so much had changed.
Oh, absolutely.
During those years, the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam War, the Black Power movement.
Right. I mean, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Yeah.
But, you know, the underlying issues of systemic racism and economic inequality
Right.
that Williams had been fighting against were still very much present.
Yeah, do you think he felt like those legal victories had made a real difference in the lives of black people?
It's hard to say for sure, but he certainly didn't see them as the end of the struggle.
Okay.
Williams continued to speak out against injustice,
Okay.
calling for economic empowerment and community control. He remained a controversial figure,
Okay.
but his voice carried a new weight,
Right.
shaped by his experiences in exile
Yeah.
and his unwavering commitment to black liberation.
So he comes back to the U.S. He doesn't just fade into the background.
No.
He's still pushing for change. He's still advocating for his vision.
Yeah.
Did he face any pushback upon his return?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, not everyone welcomed him back with open arms.
Right.
Some saw him as a dangerous radical, a
Right.
threat to the progress that had been made.
Yeah.
Others saw him as a hero,
Okay.
a visionary who had been ahead of his time.
Right.
His presence in the U.S. forced a reckoning
Yeah.
with the unresolved tensions and contradictions of the civil rights era.
Yeah, he becomes this, like, symbolic figure.
He does.
Representing
Well,
different things to different people.
Yeah, different things to different people.
Did he jump back into activism?
Williams remained engaged,
Okay.
but he also shifted his focus toward writing and reflecting on his experiences.
Okay.
His later works explored the intersection of race, class, and imperialism,
Right.
connecting the fight for black liberation in the U.S. to global struggles against colonialism and oppression. He was building on the ideas he had developed during his time in Cuba,
Okay.
deepening his analysis of the systemic nature of racism.
So he's taking more global perspective.
Absolutely.
Seeing the fight for black liberation in the U.S. as part of a larger
That's part of this, yeah.
international movement for social justice.
Exactly. And he became increasingly critical of U.S. foreign policy,
Okay.
particularly its involvement in the Vietnam War.
Okay.
He saw the war as an extension of American imperialism,
Okay.
a drain on resources that could be better used to address poverty and inequality at home.
That's a perspective that resonated with a lot of people
Oh, yeah.
at the time.
Especially within the Black Power movement.
Yeah.
And it further solidified his position as a radical voice,
Okay.
challenging the status quo and pushing for fundamental change.
Right. So even though he wasn't broadcasting from Cuba, he was still using his writing
Yeah, his writing and speaking engagements.
to get his message out.
Exactly, to expose injustice and advocate for his vision of a more just and equitable world.
What do you think is Robert F. Williams' most enduring legacy?
Well,
How should we remember him?
Williams' legacy is complex and multifaceted.
Okay.
He challenged the dominant narrative of the civil rights movement. He advocated for armed self-defense
Right.
and connected the struggle for black liberation to global movements for social change. He was a visionary leader, a controversial figure,
Yeah.
and a tireless advocate for justice.
His life story certainly makes you think about,
It does.
different paths to liberation, the role of resistance, and the limits of nonviolence.
Absolutely.
It's a powerful reminder that the fight for equality is ongoing and that there's always more work to be done.
There is, yeah. And his story also reminds us that history is often told from the perspective of the victors,
Right.
and that there are many untold stories of resistance and resilience that deserve to be heard.
Yeah.
Williams's voice, once marginalized and silenced, now speaks to us across the decades, challenging us to confront uncomfortable truths and to imagine a world beyond the confines of racism and oppression.
It's been quite a journey. Exploring the life and philosophy of Robert F. Williams.
Wait, it has been a journey.
From his early activism in Monroe to his exile in Cuba
Right.
and his eventual return to the U.S., his story is a testament to the power of ideas,
Yeah,
the courage of conviction,
absolutely.
and the enduring struggle for Black liberation.
It is. He may have been a controversial figure, but his ideas continue to resonate with contemporary movements for racial justice,
Yeah.
sparking debate and discussion about the meaning of freedom, the nature of oppression, and the strategies we use to fight for a more just and equitable world.
Yeah.
His legacy invites us to continue the conversation, to
Yeah.
engage in difficult dialogues,
Yeah.
and to never stop questioning the systems of power that perpetuate injustice.
And that wraps up our deep dive into the life and philosophy of Robert F. Williams.
Thanks for listening.
It's a story that challenges us to think critically, to question assumptions, and to keep striving for a better world. We hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on the civil rights movement and the ongoing struggle for racial justice.
Yes.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing for change.